It was about 25 years ago when I was, or maybe 24, when I was in a show club and called Shreknad. Just flip that around. And by the way, this is a fictional story, TikTok. That is until you turn all the nouns around. So it's about 25 years ago, 24, and I'm in a nightclub and I walk up to a group of people. It so happened to be the Indy 500 going on. So I walk up to a group of people and they took up about 2 tables and I started talking to them. I remember one girl had really long brown hair. Then there was a man of color, and they're just diverse fields, and they were all together. And I said, "Oh, you guys come out for the race?" Or whatever event it was at the time. And they said, "No, they were on a business trip." One of the gentlemen, the one gentleman that I'm getting ready to give a small little dance to, as I'm talking to them, I'm giving him a small little dance and asked him if he wants to go for a dance in the back, and he smiled at me, and I go, "Oh my gosh, you've got a gap in between." They all kind of laughed about it, and I go, "I'd never known any white men to have a gap in between their teeth." And it so happened that my husband at the time had a gap between his front 2 teeth, and it was his top 2 teeth. And so this guy had a gap in his front 2 top teeth. And I go, "I thought that was only attribute of people of color." And they kind of all laughed about it. He had red hair. He was pretty tall. And I took the guy back in the back and I danced for him. They were in the club 3 or 4 times. I don't remember the exactness. Well, let's flash forward about 20 years. And, anywhere between 17 and 20 years. And I'm looking at a picture of a team of people that work with Asan. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's them. So it wouldn't have been a big deal if it wasn't, this huge organization. I mean, they get like $68 million a day to fund their operations. Now, mind you, from the time that happened, when I met them in the club, I didn't know who they were. And, finding out who they were 20 years later, there's obviously a lot of things that happened from that point to the next point. I remember during that time when I was working at Shreknad, and I was putting myself through college and stuff, and helping my husband get through college too. But I met a lot of people, there's all kinds of people, whether it was politicians, doctors, lawyers. There were a lot of different walks of life. So, I asked people randomly, like, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" And, they would tell me doctor, blah, blah, blah. But there were some people that I would ask, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And they would look at me and say, "If I told you, I'd have to you." So I'm like, what? Well, I didn't believe it then. Well, with what I know now, oh yeah. Because it so happens I met a guy named Nod. And when I met this guy, he stuck out like a sore thumb in the club. I was in Anderson, Indiana. And he stuck out like a sore thumb. I remember walking up to him, and the first thing I said is, "Hey, what are you doing in here?" I said, "You seem so out of place." And so I just stopped in to have a drink, and I said, "Oh, that's kind of odd because you don't have a drink in front of you." And then he goes, and I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "Fort Lauderdale, Florida." And I'm like, okay, So, "Well, who are you? What are you doing in town?" He said, "Well, I just wanted something to drink." I said, "You want to go get a dance?" "Nope." I said, "Oh, come on. You don't come into the nightclubs for nothing. Like, come on, let's go have one." "No, I don't want no dance. I'm fine." He said, but he ends up telling me, we talked for a minute, and he tells me that he was there for a special person of interest, and it was a man that worked at a factory up the road. Well, I know that's not true. I saw him just before I found out about this team. I saw him in a parking lot in Best Buy in northern Indiana, 6.5 hours after I left my home. And it just so happens that the only reason why I was in that area was because God told me that your brother's going to get in contact with you, and you're going to go with him, and you're going to get all your answers. Well, I cried over that and everything. And sure enough, my brother, who had lived 13 hours away, calls me up one day and tells me that he's now in town. This is months later. And the way that unfolded was pretty wild. And I'll probably tell that testimony in full one time, because it was a pretty wild testimony. But for this one here, we end up going. I end up knowing that this is God telling me I need to go. But God had already told me months before then, 6 or so, maybe 8 months before then, that it was going to be a setup, that I was going to go with my brother and it was going to be a setup. And sure enough, it was. It was a setup. I was staring that Nod guy. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Nod. He doesn't live around here. Well, that guy, when he came into my life, when I saw him in the club that night, he goes, well, I got to get out of here. And he didn't want to dance. I got to get out of here. He sat and talked to me 15, 20 minutes. And he writes his number down. And he says, if you ever have financial problems, get with me. So I threw his number in my bag. I was like, nah, this is nothing. And sure enough, months later, I'm having horrific financial problems. Money is coming up missing out of the bank. Now, what's wild about that is one of the Asan people is attracted to the same sex, had been caught in one of the stations hacking into the ex-girlfriend's bank account from that station. Seems like that's what they were doing to me too, because money was coming up missing, and large amounts of it. And then when it was happening, I got receipts for everything. So at this point, I had a receipt to prove that some of this money, like I made a house payment, and then they said that I didn't make the payment, and I'm like, I've got the receipt right here. I went to bed, went to call them the next day. The receipt that I had put on my dresser was missing. Someone had taken it. So, as I said, there were a lot of things that happened, and they're incremental. And so when I go back during that time, when I very first had met this Asan team, life seemed fairly good, I mean, I was working hard. I was putting my husband at the time through college. I myself had begun to go to classes, and I was enjoying, the time, the freedom that I had with my children, because I was able to I made a lot of money, and I was able to do it in very little time. So if I worked, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, awesome, because the rest of the time I get to stay with my children. I was able to afford an expensive nanny to take care of them, to make sure that they were taken care of. And we didn't want or need for anything. But you cannot go into a lifestyle that has negative connotations and believe that you're going to come away from it unscathed. I have learned that the hard way. But I want to tell these incremental stories like I tried to tell yesterday. And as I was trying to tell it, I just kept getting really stuck, because trauma has made it so that it's very difficult for me to talk about certain things. But I have been charged by God Himself to tell my testimony and to tell it in full. And so that's why we're doing fictional stories, because my testimony is all the channels that I've ever displayed my testimonial on have been taken down because they do violate the guidelines. And the reason why is because the narrative, what's been sold to us as a people, is not the truth. And so when you start uncovering those lies, then they don't like it. So that's why we have inverted fictional stories. And so sorry for my trauma-based responses when it comes to certain topics. But hopefully I can stick to telling the full thing. And I'm going to do it incrementally. And I'm even going to utilize some teleprompters to help me. So I'm going to write it all down and utilize the teleprompters to be able to help me to get this story out in full, and for you to know that this is a fictional story. You have to invert the nouns, the inverted nouns. Till then, it's a fictional story. So I hope you enjoy my fictional story, and if you don't know what it's about, well, you can either follow